right, so our first film that we're going to review today is Joker, which has been out for a couple weeks, but it's all over town. Anyway, directed by Todd Phillips. Jim, give us a little bit of a synopsis.
So, as you can guess from the title of the film, it is basically an origin story for Batman's most iconic villain, but it's a standalone thing, so it's not really related to any of the other DC films that have come out lately. It doesn't link into Justice League or Batman v Superman or anything like that. I don't think it even links into the forthcoming one that is coming from Matt Reeves. I think it's next year. It's very much a standalone thing, and it follows a man called Arthur Fleck, who lives with his mother, is very down out on his luck. He's a clown for hire, so he's standing on street corners, twirling signs around. He wears a stupid wig. And we opened the film with him doing that and him basically getting set upon by some kids and getting beaten up in a side alley. And it basically charts then his descent, really, into becoming the Joker, into becoming this iconic supervillain. He suffers from various mental ailments. He's on a lot of medications. As he lives with his mother, and it's set in Gotham City during a garbage strike, so it's a very grimy, very depressing, kind of oppressive atmosphere. And as I say, it basically just follows the process of him becoming the Joker. So by the time we get to the end of the film, no spoilers, I mean, it's pretty obvious, he is the Joker, and it's basically just following that process and what actually causes him to become that character and what the driving forces were behind it. So it's directed by Todd Phillips, who's probably best known for comedy, in particular the Hangover trilogy, and he has pitched this to DC Warner Brothers, and it's co-written by him and I think Scott Silver is the name of the other screenwriter. So it's a very dark, it's R-rated in the States, I think it's a 15 here, so it's very much going for a challenging adult take on this character and how that character came about.
And what do you think of it?
So there's been a lot of hysteria around this film. You know, it premiered, I think it was at Venice, where it won the Golden Lion, and there's been a lot of chat about the film. I don't actually think necessarily a lot of it has dealt with how it is as a film. It's very inspired by, for me, I got very strong hints of it. There's a lot of stuff ripped from Martin Scorsese's filmography. Taxi Driver is an obvious touchstone. The thing that Hugh's closest to is undoubtedly The King of Comedy, which follows Robert De Niro as basically a crap stand-up comedian, effectively, trying to get his big break. And De Niro was actually cast in the film. He plays the role of a TV talk show host, not unlike Jerry Lewis's character in The King of Comedy. So that's a very, very close inspiration for this film. It's also got elements of other things. I got a bit of Sidney Lumet off it and kind of that kind of like New York 70s, 80s noir aesthetic. It wears its influences very much on its sleeve. I'm just not convinced it really does much with that. It feels a little bit empty to me. It feels a little bit hollow. What I will say is it does get some points for trying. It is trying to address a lot of adult themes and a lot of things that you wouldn't necessarily expect to find in a comic book film. There are comic book films which have tried to approach difficult topics before. I don't think they've done them successfully. I don't think this one does either, but I will give it points for trying to do that. I also think it looks incredible, but I'm interested in what you guys thought of it, because before I go off on one about, bits that I think didn't work, there's plenty to talk about, and there is plenty this film did well. What did you find?
Let's just get out of the way. Joaquin is, for me, this is very much somewhat of a culmination of actually quite a few roles that he's done. Watching this, the body contortions that he does with his face and everything is very much like, Freddie Quell in The Master. The romantic melancholia from Her is kind of in this as well. And of course, what I liked about it is like Joaquin has sort of played villains before, most notably in Gladiator. But in here, he plays a villain where definitely by the end, because it is the Joker, it's really cool to see him invest in some sort of evil glee. Like there's a stair sequence featuring none other than Gary Glitter, and it's parts of it is kind of fun to watch. And as someone that has heavily read into Batman and all these things, it's cool to see this character come to life up to the standard of someone like Heath Ledger. I really think like that performance is there. And of course, one of the illnesses that he suffers from is known as pseudobulbar effect, which is like this uncontrollable laughter, which in the case of this film is more aligned with some sort of PTSD rather than, I think it's multiple sclerosis that disease comes from. So I really liked it. Joaquin, that's already been said by everyone. He's amazing in it. I'm sure you guys will agree. With regards to the influences, this film, next to the films that Jim has already mentioned, there are latter parts of the film that reminded me of more contemporary films. Like, there's a very specific film that came out in 2015 called Christine that starred Rebecca Hall. And that film was obviously inspired by Sidney Lumet's Network and stuff like that. But that film was about a news anchor who, to quote Arthur Fleck himself, can't realize whether it's her or whether it is just getting crazier out there. And she realizes that the news is just feeding off of this craziness. And as per the real life story, she offs herself on live TV. And that's all I'll say. It's up to the people to watch it. I thought that was very prevalent. And likewise, Modern Times. We'll get into, I suppose, the politics maybe of the film, what it's trying to say on a social level. So as a way of introducing that, I think there is a sequence of Modern Times that really struck me. Because part of this film, it vacillates between you having sympathy, maybe empathy towards the character, and then the watcher of the film having to contend with the fact that this character is a psychopathic narcissist, that like he enjoys killing people, whether that's people that are technically in the 1%, or whether that's people that are technically on his social strata. And there's a sequence, if people have seen it, there's a sequence in Modern Times where Charlie Chaplin, the tramp, he's not really the tramp in that film, but like he gets out of a sewer, and there's a truck going. But this isn't in the film, but like there's in the Joker rather, there's a truck going by, and there's a flag on that truck, and the flag falls down. And he picks up the flag and he starts waving. It's like, no, come back. Like, the flag has fallen off. And as he's doing that, an entire army of protesters that are protesting, the poison of modern times, come up behind him, and he ends up being the involuntary leader of these protesters without even knowing it. In many ways, that's what this character is representing on a social commentary level. The film tricks you, I think, into thinking this is meant to be about, the dispossessed and disenfranchised and the mentally ill being taken over, when in fact it's about someone that's kind of hijacking all of these things for their own narcissistic gain. And it's, I don't know, it's stuff like that. It's all the technical things that Jim has already mentioned. The weird combination in the score between popular songs and this brooding cello soundtrack by Hildur Guðnadóttir, I think is the way you pronounce it. I just thought it came... Look, I was walking the street afterwards and I was thinking about it. I was like, and I watched Endgame and I thought about it for a bit, but I thought about Endgame for about 2 hours after the film. I'm still thinking about Joker.
Yeah, I was going to say, the controversy, all of everything we're just talking about, we have a lot to say about this film. So in any aspect, we have to give the film a bit of credit. And I'm kind of absolutely amazed how polarizing this film is, to be honest. I didn't necessarily know walking into it what to expect. I'm not a huge, I don't know the whole history of Batman films and Joker films and the history of this character. So I went back and did a little bit of research. But I have to say, I didn't expect it to be a comedy. I read some reviews that it was like not funny. I found it frightening. Like, it was a scary film. Absolutely. And it kept me on my seat. I also am wondering if I am so blown away by cinematography that and good performances, which I think a lot of us are, and you can't not commit to the fact that this was a very, very highly stylized, gorgeous sort of like take on New York. Similarly, it's funny that Joaquin Phoenix was also in the Lynn Ramsey film that was also very similar to showing this like gritty New York, and they both did it very well. I think this one Todd Phillips did was way more stylized, and I feel like the Lynn Ramsey film was really raw, and I really, really loved that film. And I'm sorry for you. What's the film's name?
You Were Never Really
You Were
Here.
Never. Yeah, and but I'm still kind of was blown away by that particularly. So I'll start there, and then I'll let you keep going.
So here's my thing with it, right? When I was watching the film, I swung back and forth between thinking it was really good and it was really bad. In the end, I've come out on the side of thinking it's not that great. So somewhere in the middle, but definitely towards the it's bad part of the spectrum. Now, part of the reason for this is you are both entirely correct. Joaquin Phoenix's performance is superb, right? And if I was wanting to be deliberately controversial, despite the fact that I'm not sold on the film, I personally think his performance is better than Heath Ledger's. Now, I can go into like why at a different time, because there's probably people
why?
going to be... Well, because Heath Ledger, as good as he was, it's a very showy performance. He has a lot of dialogue with which to work. The most terrifying parts of this film, and when I feel Joaquin Phoenix embodies that character, and the way that character is both descending mentally whilst also ascending in terms of his confidence and thoughts of himself, which is a very difficult mix to pull off. He's doing it entirely through physicality. He's doing it without dialogue. And this kind of I'm glad you asked me, because this gets me to the heart of what my issue is with this film. The cinematography is superb, right? The Hangover films have, for all their faults in the later entries, have always looked very good, and it's the same cinematographer here. Joaquin Phoenix does an excellent job with this performance, right? And to me, I think he needs to do more than Heath Ledger did. That's the main thing here. I think Heath Ledger had quite good material to work with, which is not to take away from his performance. It's still incredible. They're both very good performances. But the performance in Joker and the way it looks mask, for me, what is a very simplistic script. The bits of this film that do not work for me are when Phoenix has to deliver the words put into his mouth by Todd Phillips. There's a sequence at the end, avoiding spoilers around specifics, there's a scene right at the end involving the TV host played by Robert De Niro. The dialogue in it, I'm sorry, it's like it's been written by a high schooler. It's so on the nose, it's so lacking in nuance completely. And the issues that the film wants to bring up, it does it with all the subtlety of a brick through a window. And that performance is miles above the material it's been given. My issue is the more I watched the film, the more I got annoyed, because it's invoking much better films and a performance which is not worthy of the script which is here. And it's not trying to forge its own path, because there is a lot of window dressing around the edges of Batman mythos. There's basically what is quite frankly a half-baked subplot that centres around Thomas Wayne, right, who is the father of Bruce Wayne, who will, of course, go on to become Batman. And Bruce Wayne is in this film. He's in it as a child. I think he's maybe about 10 years old or something. So that's in the backdrop. It's all too willing to embrace that, and it's using all of these elements, to my mind, to elevate what is a pretty thin script. Now, it gets points for trying, because it's trying to do something more interesting than something like Endgame, quite frankly. This is for all the scope that something like Endgame have, this is a more cinematically ambitious film than a lot of the Marvel films. But for me, all the technical aspects and the performance aspects and the reality of it, and we'll come back to the reality of it in a minute, because I can see Luca's like absolutely itching to try and counter some of these points I'm making, right? To me, it is trying to elevate what is actually pretty thin material.
I also would just say I don't know where. I mean, we talk about people like Quentin Tarantino's films are completely modeled, and I actually like them. They're modeled after other films, and sort of, and this is definitely taking direct inspiration from some films, but it's paying homage to them as well. So where are we saying that this isn't, an okay film to take homage to films that I think we all sort of respect in terms of, the 70s work? I guess I didn't expect much, because when you put The Hangover in front of like as a director, I wasn't expecting that. It's a DC comic. It's an anti-hero story. It wasn't something that I expected massive amounts of. I didn't think it was going to win a massive film festival either. So I think that's maybe where I wasn't as offended by the story being, this personal story. I'm also just not a comic book kind of, I don't watch a lot of those, those films to me kind of feel like fake. And this was, to me, like a character-driven story done by, it was written for this this actor specifically, and if he was able to carry that story to the point that we could all say he did a really good job, there's got to be something in there for the rest of the team to have done well.
Well, just to address the comic book stuff, I like this just for any comic book fans that are listening to the podcast, like me. There was a lot about this film, throwing, unlike, all these comic book films that come out now where the actors have to do their research into the character and read reams of material that's come before the making of a film. This film does throw stuff out, but retains the essence of the character. A particular scene, one of the murder scenes that we chatted about this, which I won't spoil, really does this. It involves the scissors, so if you were going to see it like that, that scene retains the essence of the character, but also there's set pieces like the talk show scene, or even actually the very fact that the origin has aspects of Arthur Fleck wanting to do stand up. That's Alan Moore's Killing Joke. It's still drawing from the history of the character. On realism and the thin script, I disagree. I think there's a lot about this actually that, like you said, the film was written for Joaquin, and there was all this press about how every day they would actually rewrite the script. And look, that's not only is apparently that really commonplace for large budget films, but also it means that they were refining this film in the process. And Joaquin has said that, he was discovering new things about this character, and it really shows. I really think there's refined elements in this film that is the result of a process of really thinking about what story these people were telling. There is another film way back that this film draws influence from, and it's actually the basis for how the Joker was written by people like Bill Finger and stuff like that. There's a film called The Man Who Laughs by Paul Lenny, which incidentally is about a king kills one of his competitors and then disfigures his son so that he's perpetually laughing and stuff like that. That film is a German expressionist film. And with regards to what story and what world this film is creating, this is a story, despite Taxi Driver had a voiceover, and what this film has over Taxi Driver is that it's able to tell a first-person story without voiceover. And there are points in the film that I was literally like, oh, yeah, shit, Joker is telling the story. This, and that's the beauty of the trick of this film, is that it gives you this very 70s New York realistic version of Gotham City. And then you realize, no, this is this has been tied up in ribbons by Joker. This is, there's a subplot with Zazie Beetz' character, which is deliberately limited so that something is revealed, and if you take my point that this film has been refined, that people that made this have thought about this on every level, then the perceived shortcomings, to me, they're not shortcomings. They are the faults that someone has when they're telling a story, just as I'm trying to make my point right here very laboriously. So that's my point. This film beautifully depicts a warped version of the world as seen through the eyes of the Joker. And the final scene, first of all, Jim, you mentioned like the writing in that talk show sequence. Well, they're like, even though there's subversions in that scene, Robert De Niro talks like a talk show host would on TV. It's sort of, a moralizing white patriarchal figure that's, telling someone what they should be doing. And then the writing in the last scene for me is, I'm not going to spoil it, but it's a beautiful bookmark to how the film begins with a psychiatrist. And when you compare those two scenes, the film starts very early with the psychiatrist and ends with a psychiatrist. And when you realize where this character has come, how he's transformed, despite it being a very linear, tragic line of, he's always going to become this, he's always going to become this monster. I was bowled over. Yeah, there we go.
Right. I can totally see why someone, right, and Luca in particular, right, has explained very eloquently why he likes this film. And as I say, there are good things in this film. The main thing for me is that script, like the final scene, I was not bowled away by it. I mean, it brought to mind for me basically, like, if anybody's watched Seinfeld, right, there's a scene.
Careful.
Right? There's a scene where, like, George Costanza is trying to use a phone and he's not allowed to, and he basically just wanders off into the middle of the restaurant and just kind of like gets really frustrated and screams, "We're living in a society!" Oh, yeah. Right? Yeah. I mean, I'm sorry, that is about the level of depth of commentary that Joker gets to. And it has a lot of technical trappings beyond that, which elevate that story. But that's what it's no deeper than that.
But that's the thing. The film starts telling you we are making a social commentary, and then you realize, actually, no, we are talking about a monster that's hijacking the social commentary.
Well, that's the thing. It doesn't go into that. It doesn't. I get your point. Like, you come to realize that basically things are being co-opted for this character's own validation, his own personal objectives. Right. But the entire trappings of the film before then are not that. It is focused, like, it goes through, so there's scenes with his, I think it's his social worker, where they talk about budgetary cuts. There are hints towards the mistreatment of his mother by Wayne Enterprises, who she used to be employed by. He gets beaten up about 3 times within the first 45 minutes or something. It is all about the mistreatment of the character up to that point, and it doesn't do enough of a rug pull after to indicate that, no, this is something ingrained which this character is now getting the chance to express. It's not communicating that well enough. The other part of it is the technical execution, right, for all of its plus points and things like cinematography and all the rest of it, is very, very mixed, right, because it's going for this grimy, real feeling Gotham City. And that's where the influence of, the King of Comedy, Taxi Driver, Prince of the City, all this sort of stuff comes in. But at every point, Todd Phillips looks to stylize this extremely heavily, and the staircase scene that you mentioned earlier is a key example of that. It doesn't let it breathe. At one point, it's doing like Gary Glitter, right? And then within a second, it is fading into what is, quite frankly, a brilliant score by Hildur Guðnadóttir. Apologies to all Icelandic speakers. And it's very mixed execution. I don't think... I see what it's trying to do, and I agree that it's trying to do that. Well, I don't think it does it very well.
The staircase sequence is really interesting to me because it's the keystone for what the film is, which is... I'm really glad you brought up the music in that, because you start off with Gary Glitter, And much like the film, you start off with, you're like, oh, you're in, whether it's the darkness or the glee, or, you know, it's the general evil of this character, much akin to the mind of Gary Glitter. And then you go into these weird ambient thuds that mimic, you know, his, like, you know, landing on the steps and stuff like that, as two cops appear, as reality itself veers its head. And the film is weaving in and out of that. And look, like, again, I do, you know, just to finish my point on this, because I know we have other films to review. It's really interesting that there are a lot of African American characters in this that occupy. They're clearly in the same social strata as the main character, and they actually feel, like, even like in the trailer, you see he's on the bus and he's he's chatting to a kid, and it's a little kid, and there's an African American kid and African American mother, obviously. And that's one of the scenes where, you know, he gives the little card because he starts uncontrollably laughing. He's like, "This is my condition," and the trailer makes it seem like, oh, you know, she's just going, "Oh, you crazy asshole." No, she's actually really calm about it. She understands. The psychiatrist goes, you know, people don't give a shit about you, and they don't give a shit about me. Zazie Beetz' character, at least for the...
That's an example of that on-the-nose dialogue I'm talking about, by the way.
Well, that's true, but it's interesting to see how he reacts to that. Because Arthur Fleck, they go to him, we understand your pain, and, like, we're all in this together, but Arthur Fleck can't look beyond himself, and there's a very good sequence where he sees... I was watching another review by... on YouTube, and they mentioned this as well. There's a scene where he sees a person in a clown mask in a taxi, and he smiles. And in this review, they beautifully said it's a perfect example of someone seeing their own face in a crowd. They only see the embodiment of their own self in the world, and they don't see that they are part of one collective that is collectively struggling. I mean, it reiterates the point I've been trying to make, that he's a narcissist and he's a psychopath.
I'd just like to interject in one thing. I'd like to say, what is this film? Who is this film made for? And if you see how many people who are watching it, it is a popular film. So the idea of stylized and sort of storylines and stuff that works for a massive amount of people sort of seems to fit what would be, you know, something entertaining. And in my own sense, I was entertained. Secondly, I would say, as someone who's lived in New York, I think there's something very, very, and why Taxi Driver did it really well, why the 70s films did it really well, why this film, like, hits upon this, is there's something very, very isolating about being part of a space like that, and also being part of a group, and I definitely think that there's something very narcissistic about being there too, and like and thinking like you're the most important person in the room. So I think there is something like taking upon all of these stories about New York and all of this research, and I think there is an effort, whether or not we all agree it's done well, to sort of to have that conversation.
So the funny thing is, right, what you said there and what Luca was saying there, I don't necessarily disagree with large swathes of that. The issue for me is it has taken an iconic character, and as far as I'm concerned, it has attached it to a pretty substandard story. That's really what it comes down to. If it didn't have the trappings of this Warner Brothers DC budget, if it didn't have Joaquin Phoenix, and I realise there's a lot of ifs here, right, because the obvious counterpoint to this, well, it does have all these things, Jim, right? But the thing is, it's trying to be a smart comic book film. No problem with that. And I laud its ambition. However, the execution, for me, on the story front and the script front, is not there. If it was in any other context, this would be seen for what the script, I believe, is, which is it's very satisfied with itself. It thinks it's delving into conversations, but it's not. Like, talking about, you know, what leads people to co-opt movements or start movements, and how we treat members of society. I'm sorry, you've got to go deeper than simply putting up banner adverts and playing a clip from Modern Times. You have to go deeper than that, but the film, because it has all these trappings and it's attaching them to an iconic character, it doesn't feel like it does need to go any deeper. And as far as I'm concerned, if you're going to go down that route, then it needs to do it, particularly when you are referencing so heavily films which have done that. And I think it misunderstands some of these, right? I mean, a lot of the horror in The King of Comedy comes from the fact that it's so banal. Like in that film, Robert De Niro is basically just a guy who's really insistent, narcissistic, yes, and basically just bugs people into submission. And it's the banality of it which is so terrifying. And that's kind of what this film is looking to do, but it's so determined to be iconic and it's so determined to be shocking that it forgets to actually add the commentary. You can't just point to a topic and say, hey, you remember that? That's dreadful, isn't it? And then just, then go into the Joker dancing to Gary Glitter. It's not depth. It is
iconic, though.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, though, right? That scene is going to get played all over the shop. But the thing is, it's pretending it's deeper than it is. Just because you've attached it to a comic book property doesn't make it deep. That is masking the fact that it is actually quite shallow. I don't think it's going into it in the extent that it believes it is.
Well, I think that we're not going to agree. I mean, I'm sort of in the middle. I didn't think it was, my most favorite film. I didn't think it was that deep. I thought it was a little bit of a roller coaster ride with some pretty imagery. And I thought it was still slightly better than Bohemian Rhapsody, So, I mean...
That's not a comparison I was expecting.
Saying, if you look at who was in contention last year, right? Like we're all. I just want to say the people who wrote. I want to look at all the critics who wrote 4 stars for Bohemian Rhapsody and then gave this one a 2-star. Absolutely. I just don't understand. That's my point. Maybe my expectations of the guy who made The Hangover was was not as high as as I should have.
I hope you realize I'm expecting that to be on the Blu-ray cover now. Amanda Rogers, Cinetopia. Well, it was better than Bohemian Rhapsody.
Well, that's my theory.
There you go. Cinetopia's first pull quote.
On that note.